Now, not everyone got to grow up as part of a big family like the Nolans here.
Angelica meets one group of abandoned children who had to look elsewhere to find their sense of home.
I'm nobody's child, I'm nobody's child.
Aberlour Orphanage was one of the last institutions of its kind in Britain. Its history began in 1875 when a small cottage in the village of Aberlour in northeast Scotland opened its doors to 4 motherless children.
By 1928, Aberlour Orphanage had some 500 children, many of whom were not actually orphans, but simply poor, from broken homes or of single-parent families. For those that came here, it was a world within a world, and that time at Aberlour would shape them for the rest of their lives.
This year is the bicentenary of Aberlour Village, and as part of the celebrations, it's holding a reunion for some of the old boys and girls who are at the orphanage. One of those who has travelled furthest to take part in the reunion is Professor David Divine, who lives in Canada. He lived at the orphanage from the age of 18 months until he was 11.
My mother's family were horrified at the fact that there was a black child in the local community and that their daughter had produced this black child. Part of the functioning of Aberlour Orphanage was to rescue the children from often maltreatment, take them into a country setting and basically rebuild the children and prepare them for adulthood. Now people say, God, this is Dickensian, this is awful. But the reality is, what life did we as children and young people have before the orphanage? The orphanage is salvation for us.
One of the key elements of the orphanage structure was that each child was allocated a house mother or father. For David Divine, this was Auntie Phyllis.
Well, I recognise the back of that head.
Hello,
Hi.
nice to see you again.
Lovely to see you, lovely to see you.
David talks about you devoting so much time and you treated every child as special as your own.
Well, I hope I did. I don't think I ever sort of chose one in particular, you know. Maybe one sticks out in my mind more than others.
Yeah.
We used to have a story at bed.
That's right, I remember.
And then it was a case of going round all the beds and tucking them in and kissing them goodnight.
Auntie Phyllis gave us the strength to believe that we were okay and that we were loved and that we were worthy of love, because most of us had been dumped, ditched, and we had no one. All we had were care staff like Auntie Phyllis, and I adore this woman. I adore this woman.
Well, Dad, that was a brilliant introduction, giving us a snippet into what your childhood experience was like. Could you remember your first memory?
Good question. I think the first memory I think I ever had as a child, it would be Aberlour Orphanage. Aberlour Orphanage was the only home that I ever had as a child and youth, and I'm talking about up to the age of 19. It was the only home I ever could claim as my home, a place where I was loved and respected, and it brings back very many happy memories, because the individuals that I lived with in Aberlour Orphanage, the other children, the other boys, because remember we were separated, the boys and girls, into separate parts of the orphanage. So I only lived with other boys in Aberlour Orphanage, and they became brothers. They became family in time, because I was there for about 11 years. And so in that time, you get to know other children, and they get to know you, and you become bonded. And that's what happened. And I'm still in touch with some of those children who I was in the nursery with at the age of 18 months to about 6 years of age, before moving into another house in Aberlour Orphanage, which was specifically for older children between roughly 6, 7, 8 and say about 12, 13. And then when you reach 13, 14, you were then moved to another house for older boys, 14 to 16, 17 and 18. And that was it. That was my life. So the first memory is most definitely Abelard Orphanage. And that's because I believe it was a happy experience. I actually felt loved there. Even although it was a very large institution, 500 children at any one time at the height of its operation. So it was a huge complex. And our individual houses where we actually lived had about 30 people there. I lived in Spey House and there was 30 other boys in that house cared for by Auntie Phyllis.
That's very encouraging to hear that big institutions such as Abelard Orphanage back then could have still delivered personalized care where you did feel loved, because especially now from the UK perspective, there's quite a lot of sad stories and cases looking back at institutional care. So I'm very happy to hear that your instance was a happy one. And anytime we do talk about Abelard, you do seem to still have lots of fond memories and great things to say about it.
Yes, and I think that's very, very important, because you're quite right. There were sad things that happened too. There was abuse, physical and sexual, at times in the orphanage. I never ever personally experienced that, but the institution was essentially built up from 19th century ideas about bringing up children, and particularly poor children from the slums. And that's essentially where I came from. I was poor, I was homeless, and I was abandoned. And so Abelard Orphanage role, its mission was to try and take such children like myself from these backgrounds and try and produce, in quotation marks, young adults who would be able to work in society as productive members. And it was a mission. They had a goal. They had to change what they thought was fairly suspect children into individuals who society would see as respectable members of society. So that was the goal. They were there to change you. They were there to make you into something that they felt you weren't when you first arrived. It sounds very Dickensian. Well, it was Dickensian. It was a Dickensian institution. But within that Dickensian institution, I felt loved. I felt cared for. And I felt that I was seen as somebody who was wanted. And up to then, I wasn't. I was abandoned by my family of origin. I was essentially evicted from the home as a baby at 3 months of age. So I never had a feeling of being wanted. I found that when I arrived at Abelard Orphanage. And I will always be enormously grateful to Abelard Orphanage for that love and care.
It's very moving. And in regards to the point that you made about Abelard playing a fundamental role in the residents' lives in terms of preparing them for the future, what types of values and principles do you have today that you could say is definitely linked to the way that the Abelard community raised you?
Well, I feel that the first point that comes across in staying at Abelard Orphanage is that you have got to be independent. You've got to have a fairly clear idea about yourself and about your worth as an individual. You really have got to love yourself, care for yourself, work hard, and do your level best. And these themes have followed me throughout my life. And one other theme that was really, really important, that was embedded into us by life in the orphanage, was that you cannot use your background, your current set of circumstances, as an excuse for not doing your very best. In other words, there's no excuses. You are independent, You have got to make it. You've got to work hard. You've got to develop what potential you've got in order to move forward. No one else is going to do it for you. No one else is going to pluck you out of your present circumstances. You have got to take the lead in that. And that came across very, very strongly. So if you look at other children from my time at Abelard Orphanage, they are equally independent. They're very self-willed. They are go-getters. They're not going to allow things to get in their way and be overcome by those things. And so this feeling of, look, you've really got to do the best you can, march on, constantly move forward. Yes, when there's kickbacks, yes, when there's difficulties and you fall flat on your face, you pick yourself up and move on. Now, it's a very hard existence. It's tough, but this is what was expected of those of us who lived at Abelard Orphanage. And that has stayed with me throughout my life since.
That's very powerful. And just to kind of connect that with education, I'm your eldest son. So I know when I was coming up, value of education was really stressed aggressively at times, which is very important to you. And I know that we've had conversations where you said that education was a tool out of poverty for quite a lot of people coming from backgrounds such as yourself. So how did you prepare yourself to go to a top university such as University of Edinburgh? And what was your goal when you were at university, and how were you planning for that to springboard you into a better existence?
Well, the reality was, son, that remember, I'm at Abelard Orphanage for about 11 years. I'm then in foster care for another 8 years, and that was a very painful experience. I was back into a situation of my family of origin, for example, where I really wasn't wanted. I was a paid guest. They were getting an allowance for me. So I was never really accepted as part of the foster family. And they made it quite clear that I really wasn't part of the family. So that 8 years in the foster home was really very, very unpleasant. But I realized very early on in my foster home, and I arrived there at the age of 11, up until the age of 19, that even although I was not wanted, even although they made my life very, very difficult, I had to move beyond those sets of circumstances, getting back to the orphanage and what I was taught, and make it on my own. And this is what I did. So my family then became the school that I went to, the children that I interacted with, the children that I played with, the friends I made at school, the teachers who taught me. I made it work for me that I would make friends, I would do well at school as best as I could, I would do as I was told in order to move forward. And that is what I did at school. And then when I got the results that I needed to get to Edinburgh University, my first of 3 universities that I attended, I found that I could actually make a life for myself in halls of residence. So when I was accepted at Edinburgh University, I actually lived in university halls of residence. And that was my first home. This is 19 years of age now. This was the first time ever in my life up to then that I had my own room to myself. I had always shared with other people in the orphanage and then in the foster home. And I never, ever had any privacy, ever, up until the age of 19. And then at the age of 19 at Edinburgh University halls of residence, they gave me a key to my room. Now, this was the first day at Edinburgh University. One of the highlights, still one of the highlights of my life. I had my key, the first key I ever had to my own private space. I put the key into the room door and unlocked the door and opened the door. And then I shut it again, took the key out, did it again, took the key out and did it again. And this shows you how important this particular time was for me. This was me, David Divine, having a space which is mine. I can put my things there. They will be safe. And this was the start of my university life. And at the university, remember, I was from a poor background, a homeless background, really. And what I found was that the other students there were middle class. They were quite comfortably off. They had no conception of the life that I had led up to entering Edinburgh University. So I felt really out of place at Edinburgh University. I didn't feel that I belonged at Edinburgh University because I was really poor. I was really poor. And so getting back to Abelard Orphanage, you've got to do your level best, and that is what I did. So I worked very hard at Edinburgh University. I began to think that, well, maybe I really could enter social work, because I was studying criminology, I was studying history, I was getting a flavor of other people's lives. And I said to myself, looking at my own experience of having a social worker for 19 years before, that really I could do a better job than the social workers I ever had. And I said to myself, well, maybe I should seriously consider entering into social work. And that's what I did. I changed my course intentions. I decided that I would do a postgraduate qualification in social work, and that's what I did. I did my time at university, I graduated, and then I did a post-qualifying social work diploma at Murray House College of Education, again in Edinburgh, and I loved that. And there I actually met individuals that I could work with, become friends with. It was a huge adventure, my time at Murray House College of Education. I absolutely loved it. I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about the subject of social work, and I ended up being joint head with distinction at the end of that program. And from there, this is now 1978, I went down to London because I said to myself, I don't see really anybody else that looks like me. Now, I knew this at Abelard, but I was still very, very young.
Right.
I knew this in my foster home, even although there were one or two other Black people that I met, and indeed in the foster home there was an older Black boy living there who was adopted by the foster family, but he and I never really got on, because I was academically inclined. He wasn't. He was a sportsman, and didn't believe in education really. And so this feeling of somehow not seeing other people that looked like me became increasingly important to me during my early education at university and at Murray House. And I said that when I graduated as a social worker, I would go to areas where there was diversity, where I could see people that looked like me, and I could see lots of other people that didn't look like me, but they weren't white. And I just wanted that experience.
Sure.
And that's what I did.
Just touching on the huge accolades that you achieved at the University of Edinburgh, going back to being a joint head and finishing with distinction, explain to us what that level of pride was like for yourself, especially knowing your background and, you know, knowing how hard you must have worked against, you know, several challenges that you would have faced. Explain that for us.
Well, of course. Well, at Edinburgh University, I basically got my my degree, and that was fine. But getting a degree was absolutely wonderful. It was a great achievement, because the expectations for children in care, even now, 30 plus years later, is still seen as rather exceptional. It's not expected of individuals who are homeless and poor and who have been in the care system for lengthy periods of time to frankly do well educationally. It's not expected, and therefore individuals don't try and prepare you for such a possibility, those who are caring for you, because they don't see it as a possibility for you. What I did in getting my first degree at Edinburgh University was basically to show that yes, you can do it. Yes, it may take extra time. Yes, it may take lots of effort, but the point is you've got it. You've got your degree, and that's a major achievement. At Murray House, the postgraduate qualification college that I went to for my social work qualification, that was where I came into my own, because I really got to grips with subject matter areas that I really was fundamentally interested in. And the individuals that I was studying with were exceptional. The teachers were exceptional. They had interesting lives themselves. They had done things, and I wanted to do things with my life. I wanted to do exceptional things. I wanted at the end of the day to perhaps teach other students. And the other thing that was really important was that they were fun to be with. Now, up to that time, I didn't have much fun because I was very sort of old, in quotation mark, older than my years, and fun really wasn't seen as part of that because I was working hard all the time at school, high school, then at university, then at postgraduate qualification at Murray House College. I was very studious, and what came across at Murray House, my 2-year experience there, was that I needed to inject some fun and some excitement into my life. Now, I wasn't complaining about not having that, because
Right.
I was trying to get to a particular goal. I was trying to achieve a particular goal, and fun and excitement and going out to clubs and all the rest, it just wasn't part of the picture for me. But that changed when I went to Murray House. I still worked very, very hard, but I saw that I could have fun too, and I wanted more of that, and I did get more of that when I moved post-qualification from Edinburgh to London. And that's where I can say my life took off in London.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. And that step at Murray House definitely shows a good example of emotional intelligence, but also self-awareness. And I think what's really interesting about the time frame when you decided that, hey, you know, London is where I'm going, that was also the time where there was a huge migration from the Windrush population. Generation, sorry, as they're called now. So lots of exciting things going on, huge droves of immigrants across the Caribbean coming to help build Britain. So how did you find the London Borough of Hackney when you arrived? Because that was one of the main places, along with Haringey, where lots of Black immigrants were, and there was quite a lot of diversity, quite a lot of exciting things going on at the time. So what was it like for you, who has been in Scotland around a predominantly white and conservative setting? What was that first impression like for you?
Well, the first impression of London, first of all, London, for me, after leaving Edinburgh, was the East End of London, the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. And I'm talking about the very east, and it was a huge focal point for immigration, largely Asian at that time and Jewish. And it was a hugely diverse, exciting, colorful part of London. And my first impression was, when I arrived there, was, my goodness, this is wonderful. This is absolutely brilliant. I saw all these different colors of people, different styles of dress, different languages being spoken. And I was a professional social worker in the mix of all of this. And I lived in a university settlement called Toynbee Hall, which was absolutely wonderful. And this was where professionals, usually young professionals just starting off, could live right in the middle of these communities and do your work. I was a social worker. My office was about 5 minutes away from the settlement, and I loved living there. And also in the university settlement, you also lived with other individuals who were challenged in various ways, say with mental health issues or physical issues of one kind or another, or with varying abilities that were different to your own. And you lived collegially together, helping each other. So I was living, as it were, almost above the shop, if you like. The shop was downstairs, the social work office, and I was living in the university settlement, and did that for several years. And so my introduction to London was through Toynbee Hall University settlement, and I loved it, and I loved the people there. They were hugely, hugely exciting. I learned a huge amount. And as a social worker in Tower Hamlets for about 5 years, I really, really learned a huge amount about the communities in the East End of London, worked with them, and we're talking about usually very, very poor individuals living in very, very difficult circumstances in high-rise apartment blocks, which were really falling apart, riddled with disease of various kinds, riddled with structural inadequacies and so forth, and so forth. It was hugely important for me to be involved in trying to address some of these issues, which I did, and I loved the people I was working with. And this empathy, this reaching out to others who have had circumstances like your own, poverty, homelessness, being abandoned, was critically important to me, because I could give not only from my knowledge and learning from university and college, but I could also give of myself in terms of I could relate to individuals with those circumstances, because I've been there. And this was really important. And then from Tower Hamlets, I moved to the London Borough of Hackney, and it was a different sort of population I was dealing with, very, very much of African descent as opposed to of Asian descent. Still a large component of Jewish immigrants that I worked with, but essentially my work revolved around those who were of African descent, and also those who were very, very poor white community members who were trying to eke out an existence under incredible hardship of one kind or another. And I could relate to those individuals too. And this is what my experience of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets and the London Borough of Hackney gave me, an opportunity to use myself in ways that could benefit others. And I do believe that I helped a considerable number of people in my time in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets and Hackney. And I also learned a great deal about myself, because you can't reach out to others without having reach out to others effectively without having a very, very clear idea about your own self. And so those other people teach you too, about life, about circumstances and how they deal with it. And then you look back on your own life and you ask yourself, well, I can echo that because I've done things like that in my own life in order to move from A to B. And that's what they're doing. So my job was to enable them to move from one particular set of circumstances to a better set of circumstances. And that was my life. And I began to feel stronger and stronger that this was my purpose in life, that my journey from being abandoned at the age of 3 months by my family of origin to the work that I was doing in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets and the London Borough of Hackney was meant to be, that somehow that journey was to give me tools and learning and preparation for a later set of duties which played out in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets and Hackney and later in Brent. So there was a mission there was a purpose there,
Right.
and that became stronger and stronger.
Right. I think it's very evident, the dedication, the empathy and the drive that you had there, because in a 10-year period, you went from a generic social worker to the director of social services for the London Borough of Brent with a budget of £38 million and a workforce of 3,000. That's just really unbelievable if you think about it. Once again, somebody who's come down to London for a better existence, looking for diversity. You definitely got it. Jewish community, Black community, white community. I mean, London was a very vibrant place in the 1970s. And I have seen pictures of you with an afro as well. The audience may find it hard to believe, but you had an afro, you were looking the part, but also was playing a very serious role in terms of social mobility. When you look back at the days of being a director of social services, what type of responsibilities came with that? And when you talk about having a budget of £38 million, first of all, is that really enough to address the type of issues that you were facing? And when you're talking about a workforce of 3,000 people, how do you actually keep them motivated towards the goals at hand?
These are very, very important questions. For me, I reached the top of my profession in social work at the age of 33. So I was still a very young man.
Wow.
And I was the youngest director of social services in the UK at the time, and the first Black social services director. So I carried with me three things. A, I was very, very young. B, I was Black of African descent. And C, I came from the very backgrounds of individuals that social workers tend to deal with on a day-to-day basis. They don't expect somebody with that sort of background to reach the top of the tree. And with that comes a number of challenges, because what I've got to do as Director of Social Services is I've got to, first of all, make it clear to the staff, all 3,000 of them, that I'm there for them, that the buck will stop with me. It will not be passed down to anyone junior. I am the person that determines ultimately with the politicians what happens within the department and how certain things are going to be dealt with. So it carries huge responsibilities and commitment. My working day was about a 17-hour day during my time as Director of Social Services, and trust me, that was needed. I inherited a department that was in disarray. It had just been subject to a major public inquiry into the death of a Black child, and it was seen to be a result of incompetence and lack of awareness of social workers in working with diverse individuals and communities. So I had to take on board the fact that my department that I've just been appointed to as director was the subject of a major public inquiry that was very damning about how this department was functioning. So I had that additional responsibility to deal with. I also had the responsibility of working with essentially a newly elected group of politicians who were running the council at that particular time. And they were out to make a name for themselves. They wanted to do certain things. And some of those things that they wanted to do, such as to cut my budget by about £17 million, I was opposed to and fought against. So what I had to deal with as director of social services, I had on the one hand to keep my staff with me, to actually say the buck stops with me, to support them, to try and get the training and the learning and the supports and the resources they needed. And on the other hand, I had to do daily battles with the politicians in order to get the resources to deliver to the staff, in order to get the money, in order to get the staff that was needed, in order to plug all the vacancies that were appearing daily within the department, because we just received a very, very damning public inquiry report saying the department wasn't working as well as it should. And so my time as director was a very, very difficult one indeed. But at the end of the day, I was at the top of the pile. I had to lead, and lead in a way that gave confidence to the staff that the director has their back. The director is going to do what is needed in order to change the department around, change it from this negative picture to a positive picture. And this essentially is what I was doing. I called in subject matter experts to assist me from top universities, to assist me in trying to work out how best to move the department from A to B. And this is what I did. And then, of course, with the politicians, there was increasing difficulties with the politicians. You talked about challenges. Well, I had major challenges because they did not wish me to function in the way that I did in order to move the department from A to B, because it demanded that the politicians support me in providing the resources, the staffing, the money that was needed in order to move the department in the right direction. And by the way, that was supported also by the UK government at that particular time. And so what they decided to do was, well, challenges, they decided, well, we don't agree with you, so we want to get rid of you. But they didn't tell me. They had a private meeting, and then they and they decided they were going to kick me out. So I turned up in the morning one day, the back of 7 o'clock in the morning, to my office, and I was met by a reporter. And he said, well, what's your comment on being sacked? I said, well, what do you mean? I have no idea about being sacked. I'm going into my office. Thank you very much. Good day. I then went into my office, found out from the chief executive, who was also in his office, about what the politicians had been up to. And then I discovered that they had tried to, they made a decision to try and sack me. And of course, this gets back to Abalawa. And this self-determination, this belief in yourself, that you're going to move forward. I contacted my lawyers, who were very, very good lawyers in London, and we took them on. And and eventually the politicians had to relent. Give me say, well, okay, you're not sacked anymore, you're back in your office. I say, well, I've always been in my office, and thank you very much for taking your decision away that you'll try and sack me. But you know something, you've given me £43,000 as a farewell gift. I'm not returning that gift. I'm going to keep that, and because I see it as an apology for your appalling behaviour. And so, on that note, I handed in my resignation and moved on.
It's unbelievable. I mean, here you have somebody who literally has come in at the bottom, worked his way over a 10-year period, become the director of social services. So you're actually in the best position to actually see what works, what doesn't work. And this is all based on the practical elements of social care and social work in the UK to, managing teams at scale, setting the agenda. After the issues that you did have with the politicians, I believe it was Labour at the time that you had those issues with. And the reason why I said that is because there is a follow-up conversation to be had later on in this discussion about politics. But what I thought was interesting was, and I think perhaps this could have spurred you on a little bit from the being an independent expert witness in the Jasmine Beckford inquiry, was that there was obviously lots of changes that needed to be done in terms of policy and training. And this has actually, set you up quite nicely to then become the assistant director of the Central Council for Education and Training in Social Work, also known as CETSWA. Seeing that this was an arm's length UK government body, what type of opportunities did it actually give you to progress your career and also affect real change?
It was a very, very important move. I was invited to express an interest in this particular position, and I did so, and I was accepted, and it was of fundamental importance because essentially the Central Council for Education and Training and Social Work oversaw all the education and training of social workers in the UK at the time. And so therefore, all the social work programs of learning and education were essentially overseen by this particular government arm's length organization. And I was number 2 in that particular organization. And my particular responsibility covered the learning and education aspects in terms of the programs that social workers had to undergo in order to equip themselves with the skills and knowledge necessary to be competent in the job of being a social worker. And remember, Brent highlighted the public inquiry into the death of this Black child, prompted the Central Council for Education and Training and Social Work to re-look at the education and training and social work because it was fundamentally flawed. In other words, you don't have deaths of Black children if the social workers are better prepared at working with Black people, full stop. And there were a number of Black and visible minority children dying because of the lack of preparedness of social workers to work effectively with them. And so within the Central Council, it was decided, and I was part of this, that we would provide the tools and the education for social workers who were in college to prepare themselves more adequately to work with diverse communities. And so a spate of publications plus workshops were coordinated by staff under my responsibility within the Central Council for Education and Training and Social Work to actually deal with the negative aspects of the then training of social workers. And I'm very, very pleased with what we produced. We produced new standards for social work competence in working with diverse communities for the first time It had not been done before. And so this was hugely important. I was with the Central Council for Education and Training and Social Work for about 5 years. And I'm very, very proud of the standards that we set, which received government UK government approval and were launched with UK government support. And so I do feel that within my social work career that I have impacted the profession in a variety of ways, not only in terms of being a reasonably competent social worker myself for many years, but also in terms of the management positions that I have occupied in the social work profession,
Right.
and the impact that I have made on the social work education and training of the profession. And this wasn't something that started when I became Director of Social Services in Brent or entered the arm's length government body that oversaw all social work education and training in the UK. This started when I was a basic grade social worker way back in the early 1980s, because I was one of the figures, along with John Small and a number of other individuals, who organized the first national conference on Black children in care in the UK in 1983. We had hundreds of people attending that particular national conference. It was historic. Nothing like that had been done before. And it was all about, well, how do we care? And how do we work with diverse communities? Our standards, our ways of working, were all revolving up to that point around working with white people, white communities. Diversity was not a factor at that particular time. It was not talked about, let alone worked with. What we did, and what I contributed to, was changing that format. And I feel very proud of what I have done. We managed to change the legislation in order to address that diversity. We changed the childcare legislation. And that's a major, major accomplishment. I can see my hand on the legislation. I can see my impact. And that gets back to the themes that we have talked about emerging from Abelard Orphanage, my time in Abelard Orphanage. We have a short period of time in life. We have to make of it what we will. And we have to make the impact that we can within that very short period of time. I believe that I have done that and continue to do that now. And that all stemmed from Abelard Orphanage.
That's powerful. Thank you very much for sharing that. I really do appreciate that. And I think that that also ties in quite nicely your career in affordable and social housing as well, because between 1991 and 1996, you were the chair of Ujima Housing Association, which is the largest Black-led housing business in Europe at the time. Could you let us know how social work and social housing are connected? And then could you let us know what state Ujima was in when he came on board and where he was able to spin it to when he decided to pass on the leadership to somebody else?
Thank you very much for that question. The connection between social work and social housing is very simple. If you don't have a roof over your head, which is safe, clean, affordable, then you are subject to being buffeted around by circumstances in life, which can lead to major difficulties in terms of income. You've not got the money. In terms of where to live, you don't have anywhere to live. So you're then funneled into areas where you are more susceptible to becoming involved in antisocial activities of one kind or another because you need to earn money. So, well, why don't I just, sell drugs in order to sort of get the necessary money that I need to feed myself, to have accommodation and so forth and so on. So they're very, very intimately related. So you've got to have a roof over your head. You've got to feel safe in your place of residence. And then you've got to have sufficient income in order to pay for the rented place that you've got and to feed yourself. Otherwise, you're going to be doing things because you have to do, not because you want to, because you have to do in order to survive. And therefore, that's the relationship between social work and affordable housing. If we can provide good quality, reasonably priced, affordable housing, then you have dealt with a major plank that individuals have to worry about constantly before they can even think about earning, getting a job, earning enough money to feed themselves, and so forth and so on. So I got involved in affordable housing way back in the 70s because I was asked by the government regulators of affordable housing to see what I could do in terms of Ujima Housing Association, because it was not meeting the standards that were set down by government in terms of competency in providing the housing necessary at the right standards. Their staff were being criticized for not being up to par, and so forth and so on. So I was called in to headhunt and to basically turn around this organization. And this is on top, of course, of the full-time paid jobs that I was doing at the time.
So this is a voluntary role. It's not for profit.
No, this is purely voluntary, purely voluntary.
Sure.
So I started, I was appointed in 1991 to head this organization, and I worked with government very, very closely to turn this organization around. I won't go into detail because a lengthy period of time that I spent there. But what I can say is this organization was turned around in 3 years. We got it up to the top level of competence according to the government regulators of the time. It took a huge amount of effort. It took a huge amount of discussion and debate with the staff and with the regulators. It took a huge amount of argument and debate within Ujima Housing Association. I was not a popular man for a lengthy period of time whilst we were in the process of trying to get the changes that were needed. But at the end, when it became a very successful organization again, they were patting my back and giving me lots of plaudits. But this is something else that we face as successful Black people. And I'm speaking as a successful Black man. Sometimes our success is not appreciated by other Black people. And this is something that we need to be very careful about, because if we see a Black person being successful in a particular area, they are part of us. And we should be reaching out to them to say, my goodness, can you show us how you did that? Because other Black people would love to be in that position. We know it takes hard work. So show us the competencies that we need to learn, we need to develop in order to do what you have done. Sometimes, instead of that, some Black people feel, well, why are you able to do this and I am not? Well, the answer often is because you don't work hard enough and you don't put the effort in that is necessary, because whilst you are sleeping, having a good time, going out on the town at night, I am in my office working 10, 11, 12 o'clock, getting up again at 3 o'clock in the morning, and so forth and so on. This is how it's done. So don't take away the success of those Black people. Applaud them, ask them how they did it, support them, and then you'll see that you can do it too. And they're great models for our younger members of our communities. You know, young people need to see success around them. And
Yes.
we have success around us all. If we look, we can see it. We see it in our parents, we see it in our grandparents, we see it in those forebears who led the way for us to do the things that we're doing now. I would never have thought about entering social work without knowing that there were other Black social workers in the field trying to do exciting things to change the circumstances of those of us who are less well off than ourselves. So people follow models, and we need to model success, and we need to help others to come on board and follow us.
That's powerful. You did talk about leaving marks in terms of your success. For example, in legislation, I know a big tangible mark for your success in affordable and social housing is actually the David Divine House. And I believe I was in my teens when that came about. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, wow, there's a building named after Dad. It's huge. And I celebrated it to the best of my understanding at the time. But as time goes on, the magnitude of that achievement just keeps on growing. How do you feel about actually having a building named after yourself in one of the boroughs that you actually gave so much of yourself to for decades?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. I was enormously pleased at the invitation to give my name to this rather large apartment block named David Divine House in Hackney. It was given to me as recognition of services that I'd given to social and affordable housing. And that is important in life to receive. Many of us don't have such buildings named after us until we're dead and gone. But I got this whilst I was still quite young and had young children. And what it means to me and to my family is that the wider community has said that we feel that you've done something that really is important to us, the people of Hackney. And this is really important to me, because often social workers, those of us who work in affordable housing, don't get recognized for the enormous amount of time and effort and sweat that goes into trying to create these opportunities for other people to live in safe and comfortable and affordable environments. And so this was an acknowledgement to me and my family, which I thought was very moving. And each time I go to London, I have to say I do visit David Divine House to remind myself of this, because this was an honor not only for me but for my entire family. Because within successful people, they're not the owners of their success. They're not the sole owners of their success. They didn't do it on their own. It's those individuals who are around them, such as family, lovers, who give them the opportunity to actually do what they do. They support them. My family have always supported me. My close friends have always supported me in what I do. And I couldn't have achieved the things that I have done. I couldn't have made the impact that I have made without the constant, unconditional support and love of my family, my children, my wife, Anne, my grandchildren, all 7 of them. I couldn't do it without you.
It's a very humbling response, and if anybody knows you, that's a typical David Divine response. You know, humbly acknowledging, but then also, you know, thanking those around him that have made it possible. And I do remember as a young boy what your work schedule was like. I remember you coming home late. I remember you leaving in the morning. But one thing that I always did admire about you is you built in special time for us. So, for example, when you was on the road doing your conferences with Ujima, built in very unique experiences in terms of, you know, taking your children with you. I think as a father, that's extremely important, not only to create special time, but give your children an opportunity to actually see you in action. So as a young person, I always saw you on stages having difficult conversations, being able to do difficult things and be prepared not to be liked or respected at that time, but, you know, for the cause you were working on, it paid dividends. And I think that, you know, the David Divine House really does speak for itself. And I think that, you know, with the success of social work and also social housing, it's no surprise that you decided to venture out on your own for the next 10 years by setting up DD Consultancy. And one thing that I have to bring to mention at this time was, funny enough, your logo for the company was actually the remaining building structure that is there for Abalawa at the moment. So obviously that does, you know, go to show how much Abalawa Orphanage did play a role in your life. So for the next 10 years, it's very focused on private social work and housing contracts. Could you give us a brief summary of what that was like, and in essence, how that really prepared you for your next step, which would be you moving yourself and your family to Canada?
Thank you. Yes, the consultancy was hugely exciting. This was an opportunity for me to work with individuals and companies and local authorities in the UK on three main areas: social work, community health, and housing. And basically what I would do, or what more often happened, was that I would be contacted mainly by companies and local authorities to come in and give advice and guidance on particular areas that they were having difficulty with in the areas that I've just outlined. And on other occasions, it was to work with groups of staffing about issues that they had identified that needed to be addressed. So there's a lot of human resources included in the work that I did with DD Consultancy. In addition, I also was invited to give presentations around the world, actually, on various topics that I was then researching in. And they were mainly areas relating to visible minorities, poverty, health generally. And what it gave me was this feeling of complete freedom from having to constantly feel I needed to direct my attention and direct my wish to do certain things to other people for permission to move forward. I didn't need to go to any politician. I didn't need to go to any boss. I was the boss, and I did what I felt was right, and did so for this 10-year period. And it prepared me further for what came afterwards when we all moved to Canada. But during this period of DD Consultancy, you talked earlier on about challenges that I faced, and I gave you some of those challenges in terms of working with the politicians, being undermined by politicians from time to time, being humiliated from time to time, and simply being ignored from time to time. But also what happens with successful Black people in terms of undermining. You can level allegations against these successful Black people, and you know that mud sticks. And one of the difficulties I had during the consultancy that related to my time some 30 years before was in fact allegations regarding how I conducted myself in working in social work, even before I actually did my social work training. And so this was very, very difficult. Again, as I said, when we were talking about my directorship in Brent, I had to get lawyers involved, I had to challenge it, but also had to also acknowledge this is what happens when you are successful and in the public eye. And what you've got to do is you've got to manage these events in ways that make it clear that they are not fair, make it clear that they are unjust, make it clear that they are not true. But at the same time, you have to take it very, very, very seriously. And I've always been a very, very serious character. And so what happened, whilst it took 2 years of my lawyer's time, 2 years of constantly making it clear to the courts that we need to have a decision on these allegations, the business was very, very severely damaged. But 2 years later, and this is why you've always got to have faith and hope and trust in yourself. In 2 years, I managed to have these allegations withdrawn, and there was no case to answer, of course, right from the beginning, but it was dragged out by individuals who were basically trying again to undermine me, to basically take the base of my success away from myself. And I was not going to allow this to happen. And this is what happened. I rebuilt the business after that, and it regained its former success. So challenges will befall us as successful Black people. And what we've got to do is to be prepared for that. This is part of our history. If you look at our history as Black people of African descent, we have constantly been challenged, constantly been undermined, constantly being humiliated, constantly seen as less than. And what we've got to do is to remember that that still plays its way in the day-to-day functioning of this society. And so we've got to understand that, not accept it, of course, challenge it continuously, but challenge it in a way that you can move forward. And this is what I've always done. I don't like what's been happening in certain respects, but I have got to manage these circumstances, address them in ways that are going to get me the result that's needed. And that may take some time, but I will persevere. And this all comes from Abalawa. We were told not to give up, not to give up. We must continue along the pathway we have set ourselves. And our history as Black people tells us this. Our forebears have taught us this. We have to move forward. Take the mantle from our forebears, carry it ourselves, move forward, and then hand it to our children. So we're constantly in process. We're constantly in an act of becoming our better selves. And we need to proceed. And this is what I have done in my life. I've modeled how, in spite of the difficulties that you have from time to time in your life, it's no different to what our forebears faced. In many instances, it's less than what our forebears faced. And we have got to move on just as our forebears did. And this is the purpose of us in our short period of time on life, to make the best impact we can.
Thanks for sharing that. I do find that this framework for dealing with challenges and adversity, seems to be a recurring theme, and you do deploy it. at various stages to basically navigate through whatever the difficulties may be at that time. So just as a recap, over those 10 years, there were big triumphs, really difficult times. But in 2004, you were traveling, I believe, in the Far East where you got a call. Would you like to share that story? Because I thought it was quite funny.
Oh yes, this is now late 2003. What happened was that my wife, I'm in Southeast Asia doing some work over there, and my wife is receiving phone calls from Canada in the UK. And so she answers the phone, and she's told about myself being considered for interview for a post in Canada. So my wife contacts me in Southeast Asia saying, well, I didn't know you'd applied for a job in Canada. I said, well, no, I've not applied for any job. Well, she said, well, I'm getting these calls from Canada. So anyway, what transpired was that it was Dalhousie University, and Dalhousie University wished to set up an interview for me if I was interested in applying for the James Robinson Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies. And so I flew back from Southeast Asia, met my wife at the airport at Heathrow. She had packed my bag and my suit so I can look presentable at the interview, and off I went to Canada. And the rest is history, because I went for a week-long series of interviews for this particular position. And at the end of the week, before returning back to the UK, I was told I had been appointed the James Robinson Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies at Dalhousie University, as well as Professor of Social Work at Dalhousie University. But I had to tell them that I couldn't come immediately because I've got a business, a global business, and I would need to settle that, and obviously I'll need to have discussions with my family because they don't know anything at all about this.
No, I think that's a good point too. That's actually a good stage to jump back in. So let's just put this in context for a minute. Late 2003, business is doing extremely well after building back after a really horrific time, to be honest, personally and professionally. You're also an elected representative of the Council of London Borough of Waltham Forest, where you live in. First Black person to be elected to the Conservative Party. There's clear inroads of you being a member of Parliament in the future, undoubtedly. And there you are in Canada, Nova Scotia, going through this wonderful experience of being interviewed for this particular role. And I think it's important to let the audience know that this is not the first time they've actually been to Nova Scotia, because there was connectivity with Senator Wanda Bernard before in the late 1990s at a conference. But just to put it all in perspective, your wife, Anne Divine, is a senior professional in the probation service, a promising career. Your children are very settled in school. We've already outlined your successes. Why risk it all at this point?
And that's a great question. And this interestingly enough comes back again to Abelard Orphanage. Remember, we talked earlier about having a purpose in life, making an impact, and using what limited time you have on earth maximally. And what happened in the late 2003, when I was invited to come for an interview at Dalhousie University, was I looked at what I had achieved to date. I looked at what the family had achieved to date, and I felt this was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, if I was appointed, to basically start again in a new continent, and see what flows from there. We have always, as a family, been very international, and also we are very diasporic in that we know lots of Black people from around the world. And I felt this would be a wonderful opportunity of developing that diasporic element of the divine family. And what also struck me was that, yes, there are certain things that you may have to give up thinking about at that particular point, such as becoming a member of parliament in the UK government, which, as you say, would have been a natural follow on from being an elected councillor in the London Borough of Waltham Forest. But I felt that I felt that I needed to move the dial further forward. I felt there were possibilities in Canada that would significantly benefit not only all the members of the divine family, but would give potentially new horizons to think about for each member of the family. And you know something, that is exactly what has happened. Yes, it was a difficult transition. I have no regrets about that transition. I know it was difficult because Nova Scotia is fundamentally different to London. London is full of activity, excitement, things to do, wonders to see on a daily basis. But all these things were also found in Nova Scotia, but in a different way. They looked different. And it was about acclimatizing ourselves to that new difference when we came here. Whereas I took to it like a like a duck to water. I fell in love with Nova Scotia the first time I saw it, and I loved the people. I loved the individuals that I met at various conferences. There was something about Nova Scotia that I really loved. And of course, the countryside looks very, very much like parts of Scotland that I know so well. So in a major way, it was like coming back home for me as your father. It was coming back home. And so that's why I took the plunge. I accepted the position as chair, and I arrived 6 months after my appointment.
I do remember this very vividly. Can you briefly explain what the James Robinson Johnson Chair in Black Studies is all about and how it actually serves the Black community in Nova Scotia and also nationally?
Yes, it's the chair is an endowed chair named after a very, very important individual who is a fundamental part of Nova Scotia's history. And what the chair does, the position, is that it is a research chair, and it's about amplifying the voices primarily of African Nova Scotians in terms of contributions to the history of Nova Scotia and Canada generally, challenges that those individuals have faced, triumphs that those individuals have been successful in attaining, and also looking at how we can move forward. And in that, it's about also linking African Nova Scotians to others of African descent around Canada and internationally. So the diasporic dimension of the chair is very, very important indeed. So Black people are all around the world, are part and parcel of our family, and therefore we need to have knowledge about those other members of this wider family, what issues they're facing, what triumphs have they achieved, what are the connections between various communities of African descent, and so forth and so on. So it's a wonderful opportunity to develop those knowledge bases. And the chair is normally for about 6 years and a year sabbatical, and it moves from department to department within Dalhousie University. How I held the role and saw the role was I saw the James Robertson Johnson chair as a partnership between myself as the chair and the communities of African descent here in Nova Scotia primarily, but also I had significant interests in connecting those of African descent here in Nova Scotia and around the world. A lot of that knowledge came before I even arrived in Canada. And so what I wanted to do was to first of all find a way within the African Nova Scotian communities here in Nova Scotia to identify what areas they felt that the chair should explore, that they thought were important. So that's what partnership's all about. It's a relationship where we talk to each other about what's important to do together. So this element of togetherness was very, very important indeed. And so therefore I spent a huge amount of my time as chair being with the people within Nova Scotia and the African Nova Scotian community in particular. So I was very visible, and still am visible, very visible in Nova Scotia. I took up invitations to be a part of the membership of a variety of churches, took up invitations to speak at various events within Nova Scotia, including the school system here in Nova Scotia, took a huge amount of pride in what was seen as very, very important events to be at within Nova Scotia, and generally to amplify the voice and work with the voices of African Nova Scotians. And this is what I did as the James Robertson Johnson chair. And this was particularly evident when all of the things that I've just mentioned about what the chair's position should be about, when we held the Multiple Lenses Conference in 2005. And that conference was about looking at all areas of academic interest and see if we can pool together some of the leaders in each of those fields who can talk with a great deal of national and international authority on the subject matter, bring them all together in the one venue in Nova Scotia and have a 3-day conference. And that's what this was about. It was a historic conference. Nothing remotely like it had been done for the previous quarter of a century. And what came out of this conference was a gathering of 400 plus individuals coming together from the community, from these academic disciplines, from politics, every area of activity, coming together and talking with each other about issues relating to Black people of African descent. It was a major success. Out of that 3-day conference came a book, which I edited, titled Multiple Lenses, Voices from the Diaspora Located in Canada. And even today, in 2021, it is still sought after.
I do remember quite a lot of these milestones and experiences quite clearly, because at the time I actually spent quite a lot of time going around with you and supporting you with quite a lot of the administration. How were you welcomed by the community, especially as the community has unique pressing needs that they may feel that only African Nova Scotians could really understand? So you did mention your partnership. How did you nurture that partnership to actually encourage trust and confidence in you as chair?
It's a great series of questions. The first thing that I have to say about the African Nova Scotian communities here in Nova Scotia is that they took me on trust. They saw this black man who they had seen before, speaking at a couple of conferences before I was even approached as a possible James Robinson Johnson chair. And they seemed to see somebody who was open, who was engaging, who obviously was successful in his own right, and who would listen and act on what he was told. And also I was engaging in that if you contacted me, I would respond. If you come up to me and speak to me, I'm going to respond. I'm going to be civil. I'm going to be courteous, because I see you as important. You are important to me. The chair needs to be a visible presence in these communities. The chair needs to be responsive. The chair needs to be engaging, and they saw that in me. And I believe I have their love, and I have given my love and dedication to the African Nova Scotian communities here in Nova Scotia. And that has come out and become evident in how I have been approached, how I've been regarded, how I'm treated when I'm at various events. And part of the introduction of me as the chair to the African Nova Scotian communities was through the church, because I am church going. That's not to say I'm a saint by any means, but it means that the church and religion and our histories as Black people is critically important to me and part of me, and therefore I will develop those things wherever I go. And so when I was here, and still am here and will always remain here, the church was a very, very important part of my introduction to the African Nova Scotian communities. And I do believe that was seen as a very positive indicator as to how I would progress. In terms of being an international figure and traveling around the world and being based here in Nova Scotia, that has strengthened the chair. There's no debate about that. In that I can pull in from other areas of Canada and from around the world, experiences, histories, challenges, triumphs of Black people of African descent in a variety of different countries. And that builds the knowledge base of those of us of African descent based here in Nova Scotia. So I believe my international dimension has assisted the chair's position, how I approached the chair, how I saw it as a partnership, have all, in my view, strengthened the chair's position. And of course, it's up to each individual chair every 7 years to determine the course that they will pursue whilst in that chair. I have given you how my vision of the chair and how I did it, but other chairs may well see it differently.
That's fantastic. Already covered the accountability in terms of how you were judging success, not only for yourself, but also for the role. I understand that on an annual basis, you used to share what the agenda was for that particular year, keep it very much out in the public, and then give a follow-up in terms of, how you matched up to those objectives. And you basically put yourself in a fishbowl, as it were, to basically be heckled if you didn't deliver, which I thought was quite brave.
And thank you very much for that. And that's very, very true. It's all about being transparent. And as you said, you're in a goldfish bowl. I actually saw the chair as a position where the wider African Nova Scotian communities in particular can see what they're getting for their money. And they have a right. They have a right to make a judgment as to whether you have been a competent chair or not. And I have no problems with that at all. And I wanted to give them the necessary information that they can make an accurate judgment on that. I believe that I was a very successful chair. The products of that success have all been placed on the website of the James Robinson Johnson Chair. And I believe that that was done with the full support of the African Nova Scotian community. And I am very grateful for that and always will be grateful for that. But accountability is critical. And this is something that has been an area where we as Black communities, not just here in Nova Scotia, have been largely short of when it comes to our organizations. We must prove that the investment made in us is actually benefiting the communities of African descent. And there's no debate about it. There are questions about some of the organizations in that regard. I wanted to make sure that with regard to my time as a James Robinson Johnson Chair, there would be no questions whatsoever about the impact that was made regarding my tenure.
Looking back at that time frame, there was great traction being made. Multiple lenses was an incredible adventure, I would say, because I was actually in your office at the time, and I remember just how much community involvement there actually was. It was actually very inspiring hearing, phone calls coming in from the University of Toronto. You had, delegates coming from the States. They were local stakeholders. One thing that I personally would like to think that you did was you brought a level of corporate interest to the chair as well. And that was evident in the $3.8 million raised over 4 years for the position of the chair, which I thought was really good. And an interesting aspect that developed on top of your responsibility as chair was being appointed by the Governor General as a director of the board of directors of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. How would you actually explain how that felt in terms of, being appointed at that level? And how did that then tie into the role as chair? How were you able to add additional value?
Thank you very much. Again, another very, very important question. And this was quite early on in my tenure as a James Robinson Johnson chair. I was contacted regarding this major appointment. And I thought very carefully about it as to how it could add to the position of the James Robinson Johnson chair. And I felt it could, because this is Canada-wide, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And it would add to what I have already said, that I wanted the chair to be less provincial, less local. I wanted it to what it was doing to spread out across Canada. I wanted it to be known. I wanted it to be respected further afield. And I wanted people to know about it, because many didn't know about the James Robinson Johnson chair at Dalhousie University. And therefore, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation was a wonderful opportunity for getting that further knowledge spread out around Canada, just like the Multiple Lenses Conference, having academics and professionals and community activists from across Canada and internationally coming into Halifax for this 3-day conference. It became very, very much better known after that event, the James Robinson Johnson chair position, that is. And so I feel that the Canadian Race Relations Foundation was a major boost to the James Robinson Johnson chair. And it also allowed me to make contact with other Black communities around Canada. And that also led to some of the invitations to speak at the Multiple Lenses Conference in 2005, because I had that additional connection that I could draw on in order to find out who was doing what in particular parts of Canada, and particularly who was doing what in areas that were unknown here in Nova Scotia, because there was a feeling when I first arrived as a James Robertson Johnson chair that somehow Nova Scotia was rather extra special. That was the black community of African descent focus within Canada. And there was no mention really made of other areas within Canada where histories, experiences of individuals of African descent and who were black were actually being talked about here in Nova Scotia. And I wanted to broaden the discussion, not only across Canada, but internationally. And the Canadian Race Relations Foundation gave me a further opportunity of doing that. And I believe we did do that. And the book itself gives you a wonderful outline of varied experiences across Canada. And it's still quite unusual to find texts of that nature here in Canada. So it's an area that needs to be further developed. I'm seriously thinking of having a further updated edition of the Multiple Lenses book put out in the next year or two.
That sounds very encouraging. It sounds very encouraging, Dad. And I know that amongst trying to connect different Black communities together, develop new stakeholders, you were also not afraid in terms of, shaking things up. And I remember very distinctly, there was a circumstance with Jared Taylor, who's a white supremacist from the United States, and the editor of the white supremacist magazine, The Renaissance. You both were going to have a debate in Halifax, actually. And it was highly controversial at the time because it's very risky for somebody of your level representing such a prestigious university such as the Dalhousie University to be associated with this, because nobody could really understand where it might go next. What was that experience like? Why were you so adamant that you wanted to set up this platform for somebody who clearly has a right-wing agenda? What was the motivation behind facilitating this?
Another great question, Sam. Well, the first thing is, remember my vision for the chair. The chair's position is to amplify the voices, concerns, achievements, issues of Black people of African descent, particularly those based in Nova Scotia. Part of right-wing reactionary racism against Black people is obviously a major factor of consideration that Black people of African descent have to face. And you can't hide away from it. You can't ignore it. You've got to face it full frontal. And I believe that the James Robertson Johnson chair has to address that head on. And when the work of the James Robertson Johnson chair about addressing such racism became more apparent internationally, it attracted interest from a variety of corners, including those right-wing reactionary forces that were having a field day in the USA, as of course they are doing now and have been, particularly over the last 4 years. In terms of Jared Taylor, what he was basically saying was that we are, as Black people of African descent, inferior, and that no amount of trying to talk differently about it is going to pool non-Black people and Black people together peacefully. It's not going to have any effect whatsoever. And so he basically was very, very much arguing along the lines that Black people are and white people are superior, and that he was stating he's got all the evidence to back those assertions up, and that black people of African descent should know their place. And that is very, very much akin to how it was in slavery. We were not human. We were not safe to be with. We couldn't make decisions of our own. We had to be managed in a way that basically contained our, in quotation marks, natural instincts, and keep those in check, just like our slave owners over the past 400 plus years of slavery. That was his line. And he was unashamedly proud of his line of argument. And therefore that needed to be addressed, because it was unusual to have somebody so absolutely upfront about their racism and their pride in it. And I felt that needed to be tackled at a public gathering here at Dalhousie University at that particular time. And then, as you quite rightly said, that attracted a lot of concern here in Nova Scotia. A lot of people, by the way, were quite interested in hearing what he had to say. And they're also quite interested in the response that I would be making to it. And so that is why I felt that it needed to be pursued. But then it became clear that he would use this opportunity to perhaps attract further individuals to his cause. And this would then have a backfire impact on others here in Nova Scotia, some of whom would be black. And so it was cancelled. It was cancelled, and he had to find another source to spread his words. But we were ready for him. I did, however, give my presentation relating to race relations, but he was absent from that particular audience.
Thanks for that recap. I mean, even though it didn't take place, and it didn't get the stage that you or him initially wanted it to, I think it was definitely worth mentioning the fact that you're not scared to deal with uncomfortable situations, and dealing with these things head on was not only important back then, it's really important now, especially with what has just happened in the Trump administration. I mean, we really feel as if we haven't really moved on from these type of characters.
And this is a very, very important point as well, Son, that you've just hit on. We don't even need to go back for the past 4 years to get a real flavour of the enormity of the pressures that black people of African descent are under, and the fact that there is a clear willingness amongst certain sections of the non-black community to encourage this sort of thinking and the actions that follow from that thinking. And in the Divine family, on your father's side, I am directly linked to slavery in South Carolina. My father's forebears were slaves in the plantation in South Carolina called Rose Hill Plantation. And this plantation was owned by the then governor of South Carolina, William Gist, G-I-S-T. And my family relatives are actually buried on the grounds of that plantation, which is still open, part of it, still open to the public in South Carolina. So to have this direct connection through my father of being part of slavery, being owned by a white man, and having his name still the surname of my family in South Carolina, is a direct reminder to me of why we as black people have to take this reactionary white racism very, very seriously indeed, and combat it at every opportunity. William Gist, the then governor of South Carolina in 1858, was what was called the secession governor. He wanted to maintain slavery against the will of Lincoln. And he was absolutely adamant about the qualities of Black people, the inhumanity, the lack of humanness of Black people, and so forth and so on. So the likes of what we've seen over the last 4 years is not new. It has a continuous passage back to that time in 1858 when William Gist was the then governor of South Carolina. And we, as the Divine family, carry that personal record within our genes. Our forebears are buried on that plantation. Our forebears and our current family members in South Carolina still carry the surname of the plantation owner. And I refuse to be owned by anybody else. And this is part and parcel of the themes of my life that I've tried to hand over to my children. And that is, no one owns us. We are independent. We are very special. We love ourselves. We are very proud of ourselves. And this is something fundamentally important because it drives you in particular directions. You don't allow yourself to be pushed around. You don't allow yourself to be humiliated. You don't allow yourself to be disrespected.
Sure, we'll touch base again on the South Carolina family connection because that hasn't been introduced yet, but you've given us a really good stepping stone there. So the JRJ chair is going extremely well, building from strength to strength. And on the 5th of March, 2007, your life was flipped upside down. So were the lives of your family as you was hit by a speeding out of control car on the sidewalk as he was walking to the gym. On arrival at the emergency department of the QE2, it was noted that Mr. Divine's initial Glasgow Coma score, GCS score, was indicative of a severe traumatic brain injury. The expectation was he would not survive the damage caused by the accident. When you hear things read out like that about the accident, how does that make you feel? And what was your first memory after that car accident?
Well, I can't remember anything about the accident because I was in this coma, and it took a long time for me to emerge from it in terms of understanding what had happened and what the impact of that accident had on my life. I would say it took about a year for me to have a reasonable idea of that impact. And the first memory I have of that time, not of the accident, but of that time in 2007, was looking at myself on the bed, immobile, because there was so many breakages and ligament tears. I didn't recognize the man I was looking at. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move because everything was broke. I could see, thankfully, but I didn't recognize my own children, didn't recognize my own wife who were around me at the time. And so I knew that something dreadful had happened, but what that dreadfulness was, I didn't know. I just knew that I had full-time care in the hospital and I was there for 4 months in the QE2.
Just to list the injuries, we're looking at severe traumatic brain injury, right facial fracture, right shoulder fracture, right hip fracture, right tibia fracture, left ligamentous injury to knee, including MCL, ACL, and partial PCL ligament tears. I mean, these are horrific injuries. And I remember being with you throughout your rehabilitation process and when you came home. One thing that I do remember very clearly was an early desire to basically come back from this. So when we look at themes again, in terms of you using that framework, in terms of dealing with adversity and dealing with challenges, it was also in motion here, even though you weren't in your normal frame of mind. What I did find very interesting was shortly after this accident, you were still able to write and publish 2 books, The Multiple Lenses, Voices from the Diaspora, and also Abalawa Narrative of Success. in 2013. Where did you get the bandwidth and the strength to really, you know, pull this together whilst you were still recovering from such a traumatic experience?
Thank you again for that question. I left the hospital, as you know, in a wheelchair. And then after a period of time, a long period of time, I graduated to crutches with the support of a full-time carer who actually sort of walked beside me to make sure I didn't fall down. And then from then to a walking cane, which periodically I still use depending on how well I feel on particular days. And that journey took me about 10 years. In terms of the theme that you've mentioned, in terms of moving forward, I refuse to be beat by circumstances. We are going to find a way around this in order to move forward. And it was finding the pieces that I needed to find in order to move forward that took up that 10 years period after the accident. And the overriding motivation was that my life had unfinished business in it, and I wanted to finish that business. So I wasn't quite ready to meet my maker in 2007. He allowed me some additional time. And as I've said before, we only have a finite period of time, a very short finite period of time on Earth to make your impact, and you've got to use it wisely and well. And even although I had severe limitations in terms of being physically and mentally well after the accident, I was determined to use what capacity I still had, in order to maximize what impact I had left to do in terms of my time on Earth. So that was the motivation in moving forward. And there was no debate about that motivation. Once I set my mind to it, it happens. It's as simple as that. And so the Multiple Lenses book, thankfully, had been in preparation by myself prior to the accident. The accident added some additional time to it, but I can see myself in the hospital shortly after the accident, trying to make sense of some of the words and some of the things I needed to do. And that was completed when I got home. So I was determined, absolutely determined, to make sure that that book reached its publication date. And it did come out the same year that I had that near fatal accident. So I was very, very pleased with it. And I still am very, very proud of the product. I believe it's an excellent product.
That's a huge accomplishment.
Oh, thank you. And in terms of Abelard narratives of success, I've told you already about the impact of Abelard orphanage on your father's life, both at the time when he was in the orphanage and since. It's always been a continuous thread and will be until I die. Now, what I wanted to do in 2011 was, I was feeling a little bit better. I was still finding difficulty walking, but I wanted to travel to essentially build a firmer picture, a more fully portrayed picture of my life, because I felt that I needed to tell my own story to my children through an autobiography. And to do that, I needed to find out a little bit more about my family, my own family origins, my father, my mother, and also find out a little bit more about my experiences at Abelard Orphanage, the people I was with, just to remind myself, because the orphanage had been demolished many, many decades before. And so that's what led to the production of the book Abelard Narratives of Success. It was part of a PhD degree that I was doing at that time, interrupted by the accident, and still to complete. But what I did was I interviewed 23 former Abelard Orphanage boys, many of whom knew me at the time I was in the orphanage, and we were talking about each of our lives and how Abelard Orphanage impacted on our lives, both at the time we were in the orphanage and since. And that led to the book Abelard Narratives of Success. And there's going to be a follow-up to that in the next year or two. So that's, and the reason why that particular book is very, very important is because therein you can hear the stories, the pain, the hardship, the struggles of individual poor youngsters, homeless youngsters, abandoned youngsters like myself from Abelard Orphanage talking about their life, both then and since, what they've done with it, what decisions did they make. Wonderful, wonderful stories in that particular book, and there'll be more in the next book. And so the drive that you've asked me about that managed to get me through the publication of Multiple Lenses and Abelard Narratives of Success essentially came from a very, very strong belief that we have a short period of life to make an impact. You've got to use it when you've got it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Simple as that.
I do remember a level of determination as well for you to, like you said, resolve this unfinished business. I remember very distinctly at the time, it was almost very similar to 007 James Bond type of stuff, where, you know, you reached out to some French investigators and they basically found your father's family very quickly. And we got a photograph back, which sent shivers down all of our spines because your dad had the same mouth as you, and that then opened up a whole nother chapter and meaning for you in terms of family, because you unlocked a missing part of your life, which was, you know, you have brothers, you have sisters, you have nieces and nephews. How was that for you when you first went down to South Carolina and you embraced family members for the first time?
Well, it was a wonderful opportunity, and a lifelong opportunity that I have I've thought about over many, many decades, because I knew about my mother, my birth mother. I knew a bit about her. I knew absolutely nothing about my birth father. And then it became clear that when I was researching and looking at the Abelard Orphanage records, I discovered that he was in the American Air Force, and that there was a possibility of trying to track him through the American Air Force. And he was over in Scotland at the time in 1953 doing some post-Second World War business. He was quite a senior officer. He occupied the most senior position in the Air Force that a black man could attain at that time. Because remember, this was the height of segregation in the States.
So did they cap it? Did they cap how high you can go even in the military time?
Oh yes, in the military you couldn't become in the military in the US you couldn't become an officer, and that was it. So you went up to just before an officer position, and that was your limit. And the reason for that was simply that you were black, and that was it. So, height of segregation in the States. And so what happened was that I employed international private detectives from France at the recommendation of my lawyers in London. And they said, well, try them. They normally are involved in trying to find out where criminals have stashed their loot around the world. so they may not be interested in what you want to do, such as find your father, but they might be interested because it's the same sort of journey that you have to take in order to find stolen loot. And so I contacted the French private detectives, and they were absolutely delighted in taking on the work because they said they'd never been asked to do this before. And so they went about their business. And as you said, within a matter of weeks, they came back with his details, all outlined, which I still have on record. And not only his details, but where he lived, who he was married to, where the children he had still live, sent a photograph of my father. And I was absolutely delighted because this was my father, this was his family, these were my brothers and sisters, and within a matter of weeks, I was on the plane with your mother to South Carolina. So we got to Spartanburg and were met at the airport by my sister, Sandra. And from there, we met the family. We had the DNA tests to make sure that this actually was my family, even though they said right away, you're definitely part of this family because you look so much like Dad. And the DNA test came back 99.9% certainty that this was my father. And I discovered a whole new side to my family. And the reason why that was so important to me was that, remember, my family on my mother's side totally disowned me as a baby at 3 months. I never really made serious effort since to try and make a connection with me, right up until my mother's death. Never happened. Indeed, when I was with you and David, our youngest son, when we were in Northern Ireland looking for my mother's grave, round about 2011.
Yes.
On my mother's gravestone, all her children are named. And I'm looking down the list for my name. And there was a load of children I never even knew she had. And my name was not there. So you fast forward now to a few years later when I find my father's family in South Carolina, Spartanburg. I was completely embraced by love and care. They were so shocked and so interested in welcoming me to their part of the family base in South Carolina. And so the contrast was very vivid for me, very, very vivid. And so you ask how I felt when I first saw them. I felt so relieved, so happy, so fulfilled. I had found my family again. And so there we have it. So my mother is still very, very important to me, irrespective of being abandoned and left and discarded, and she moves on with her life. Those members of my mother's family that are younger can contact me and do contact me from time to time, and I love that too. My father's family have openly embraced me from the first opportunity they had of making contact with me. The contrast is so vivid, it speaks for itself.
I do remember that, and it's for me as your son, you know, you've been a great dad, and I know that having that void on your side in terms of not having a dad has had an impact on you, and the fact that you are now later on in your life, you know, connected with your dad's children and grandchildren and great grandchildren is just amazing to see and witness. So I'm really excited for you. When you look back at those different pieces that have been missing, you know, you're beginning to assemble everything together later on in life, and inevitably with the accident and moving forward, the JRJ chair chapter, you know, has closed. There still is connectivity in terms of the same themes and the type of projects, community involvement that you still really care about. But how are you keeping yourself busy now, as I understand that you're the managing director of Footprint Life Coaching? So if you could just briefly let us know what that's about, what type of projects you're working on, and if there are individuals in the audience who might be able to utilize your service or recommend you to other organizations, what areas do you focus on, and how do you provide value?
Thank you very much for that question. Well, you won't be surprised to know that Footprints Life Coaching is essentially about three things. It's about research, It's about presentations, public speaking. It's about consultancy. And it's about giving individuals the opportunity to see how special and worthy they are. So working with individuals to basically find out what their purpose is in life and what they want to do with their life, and helping them to find ways of fulfilling what they wish to do with their lives. That's what Footprint Life Coaching is all about. In terms of the actual overall theme of Footprint Life Coaching, it's about amplifying the voices of those whose voices are not being heard. And that really is critical, because many of us in life, particularly those of us who are Black and of African descent, we find that we're not heard, where individuals don't wish to hear what we have to say. What we have to say does not matter. I take a qualitatively different view to that. I believe that all of us have voices that need to be heard. And it's about trying to help individuals get the audiences to listen to those voices. So in short, that essentially is what Footprints Life Coaching is all about. And it is no different to what I've been doing for the past 40 plus years. My job has been in social work, in education, in community development, has all been about amplifying the voices of those that I connect with and reach out to. I hear what they have to say. I try and work out how I can address what they're saying. And so Footprint Life Coaching is no different to what I've been doing over 40 years. I'm even better at it now than I was then, because with experience and with time in this field, you do become better. You can listen more intently. You can hear what needs to be said more quickly, and you can connect with individuals more readily because of your depth of experience and knowledge gained, sometimes painfully, over the previous decades.
It's clear that this is basically just an evolution, really, in
Yep.
terms of your interest areas and how you're building on it. And what I have found quite interesting, and I think that we strangely have COVID to thank for this, is that it has allowed you to be accessible to a lot more audiences and individuals, because you have been able to embrace online technologies such as Zoom meetings, webinars. You're able now to connect with a lot of different audiences and, you know, be a part of many different individuals and organizations' plans and projects that they're, you know, focusing on. But back down to Nova Scotia, just kind of as a summary, as this is framed around leaving a lasting impact on the community here in Nova Scotia, the type of value that you have brought with your community involvement and partnership, what are some of your main achievements and accomplishments that you would like to remind the community of, and also just encourage us all to still pay attention to it, as, you know, this is an ongoing process?
Thank you for that opportunity, Son. I think the first thing that I would like to remind the audience of in terms of contribution is that I have been a very, very willing listener to the voices here in Nova Scotia. And by that willingness, I have learned a huge amount about the histories, the experiences, the needs, the concerns, the worries of individuals here in Nova Scotia. And in turn, I have sought to address some of those. So that's the first point I would say. Secondly, I have been a very, very willing part of Nova Scotia. And this is really important too. So not only do I listen, I actually live here and wish to continue to live here in Nova Scotia and work with those in Nova Scotia on the whole variety of areas they feel that I have a contribution to make in. The third thing I'd like to remind individuals of is that I come with a breadth of experience and knowledge, which is of value. And this gets me also back to our forebears and elders. Elders, and I now am one, should not be undervalued. They should be respected as I am, acknowledged as I am, and cared for as I am, because they are dictionaries of possibilities that can be explored. They have a knowledge base which is hugely important, which we're losing because we're not recording it. They have value in sharing experiences they have had, which we as a younger generation may not have had or ever will have. So we have to learn from our elders. So don't discard them. Don't ignore them. They may irritate you at times, but you must listen, learn from them, respect them. And the last thing I would say in terms of contributions is that I believe I have a track record, and it's not just me saying I have a track record. You can see my track record. You can Google it. You can see it in a building. You can see it in legislation. You can see it in commendations, all on record. So you don't need to take my word for it if you don't know me already. It is there. It is there. But in terms of me personally ending this particular interview in terms of contributions, I would say that I have given what I normally do when I undertake any activity. I have given you my very, very best. I couldn't have done any more. I've used up all my energy. I've given you my best. Accept my word on it. And if you don't accept my word on it, you can Google.
No, it's powerful. And I think that the fact that, you have moved, you've relocated your entire family, and you have invested, also financially into the community, emotionally into the community, and the type of projects that you did under the chair, it didn't stop when the tenure ended. You continue on to do the same type of work. So I do believe it is evident there. So there's no doubt about it. You're a hardworking fellow, family man. You've put in a lot of time for other people. You're a granddad now. Technically, you can retire. What's next?
Good question. I have always, I have to say, put other people first. And I've put my own particular interests and needs and wishes, not so much on the back burner, but I basically do it when I feel I've done everything else, as it were, for other people. But now what I'd like to do over the next 5 to 10 years, I'd like to basically do a number of things that I've done bits of, but not as much as I would like. I'd like to travel again post-COVID and go to China, India, Tibet, Russia, places I have not been to. And also revisit Southeast Asia, which I adore, absolutely adore. Love the people, love the culture, love the religions, absolutely adore it. I'm going to continue writing and preparing another 3 books. I've given you indications of what one of them is already, all nonfiction, featuring stories about lived experience and my own, and those of others I admire. I will still undertake pieces of contractual paid work on areas that interest me, if I wish to take them on. I aim to be in a position, and this is important, where I do not need to work if I do not need to or wish to in order to survive. And this is a great privilege which very few of us have in life. We always have to work for money in order to, pay the bills, put breakfast on the table, and so forth and so on. I want to be in a position where I don't need to do that anymore. And I want to allow myself to relax, because I've never done that before, you see, and because I've always been so busy, always doing things for other people. I'm not complaining about that, but that's just been how it is. So I want to allow myself to relax and enjoy the latter years without worry and stress, as I feel I deserve that time, bearing in mind what I have been through throughout my life. And this is also another important point about the life you have and making the most of what you have. You've also got to love yourself and value yourself. And therefore, you've got to say to yourself from time to time, look, I need to enjoy myself. Look, I need to have a good time. Look, I need to have some adventures. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. You're doing no one any harm. Just get on with it. I also want to keep myself fit and strong and mentally alert, because that's important. I'm no good to anybody else if I'm falling apart. It's as simple as that. And I want to keep myself in touch with the world and regional events and contribute when I can to those. And that's what using your time well is all about.
Well, no surprise there. I know that you're an avid traveler, but I do really appreciate what you're trying to focus on in the next 5 to 10 years. And there's no doubt about it. You definitely do deserve that. And I would really like to thank you and also the Black Brotherhood for, giving us the opportunity and a platform to not only celebrate your professional life, but also highlight the contributions that you've made to Nova Scotia. And for us to actually give Nova Scotians an insight into what you were doing prior to arriving, because as an immigrant myself, I'm back in the UK now, but I know what it's like to move to a different country. And often when you move to a new country, you're normally assessed by what people see at that particular point and, beyond. Oftentimes as immigrants or migrants, what you were doing prior to often doesn't get an opportunity to be highlighted. So we're extremely grateful to the Black Brotherhood for the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful celebration. And at this particular point, would like to open up the floor to questions that you may have for Dad.